The spotlight from a Japanese destroyer sliced across the sea like a blade in the dark. It missed the bow of PT-164 by mere feet. Engines dropped to idle. The small wooden craft drifted silently off Cape Vella La Vella. 23 American sailors pressed themselves flat against the deck, trying to vanish into the night. Behind that destroyer, 3 Japanese transports carried nearly 8,000 enemy troops headed to reinforce Kolombangara. The date was July 19, 1943, and in 4 minutes, those soldiers would never reach shore. Chief Petty Officer Thomas "Tom" Harrigan gripped his twin .50 caliber machine guns so hard his hands went numb. Nearby, Ensign Robert Dutch Vandenberg murmured bearings to their captain, Lieutenant Commander Arthur McPherson. Only the faint green glow of the compass lit the deck. In the moon's shadow, PT-168 and PT-171 waited for Tom's signal. They were part of the Navy's newest gamble. Fast wooden boats built not to match the enemy in strength, but to outthink and outrun them. Tom Harrigan had once served on a North Atlantic destroyer. Now he was aboard what looked more like a pleasure boat than a war machine. PT boats were just 80 feet long, made of mahogany and powered by 3 Packard V12 engines. They had no armor, barely any protection, just speed, stealth, and punch. With 4 torpedo tubes, machine guns, and a single 20mm cannon, they could strike hard and disappear even faster. When Tom first saw PT-164, he thought the Navy had gone mad. But then he met McPherson. At 28, Mac was a veteran, Pearl Harbor survivor, Midway veteran, and a man who'd seen enough. "I'm done being a target. It's time to hunt." Mac didn't believe in fair fights. PT boats weren't built for slugfests. They were made for ambushes, for striking from the dark like wolves. The crew? A strange mix of brains and brawn. Dutch Vandenberg, their XO, had taught math at Yale. He could calculate torpedo angles faster than most men could blink. Chief Mechanic Carlos Mendoza once built race engines in Los Angeles. Their radio man William Sparks Patterson came from the silent world of submarines. And their torpedo man, Paddy O'Brien, treated his weapons like fragile brides. Each torpedo weighed a ton and cost more than a house. Paddy polished them, tuned them, talked to them. "These beauties are our only chance," he'd mutter. "Miss once, and we're just floating coffins." Training at Melville had been brutal. PT crews had to be sharp, fearless, and ruthless. They practiced high-speed attacks, learned to navigate by instinct, and trained to think like pirates, not like sailors. Commander James "Wild Jim" Patterson had escaped the Philippines by PT boat and drilled one lesson into their heads. The Japanese expect tradition, give them chaos. By late June 1943, the crew arrived at their forward base in Rendova, near the start of the New Georgia campaign. The base was nothing but fuel drums, camouflaged huts, and a palm leaf dock. The air reeked of rot and diesel. Artillery thudded constantly from across the water, where Marines fought to take Munda Airfield. PT-164 was part of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9, 12 boats ordered to stop Japanese reinforcements. The mission sounded simple: patrol the waters and sink anything with a rising sun flag. But the islands were a maze of reefs, jungle, and enemy eyes. The Japanese had float planes, coast watchers, and destroyer squadrons trained to hunt PT boats. Their first patrol, on July 5th, ended in disaster. Alongside 2 other boats, PT-164 moved to intercept a Japanese convoy. But a float plane spotted them too soon. Within minutes, 4 destroyers swept in, guns blazing and searchlights piercing the dark. They ran. PT-158 wasn't fast enough. A 5-inch shell struck it dead on. The explosion ripped it apart. 12 sailors lost in a flash. PT-164 and the others escaped only after hours of dodging through coral reefs and volcanic shoals. Not a single torpedo fired. Not a single enemy ship hit. 1 boat gone. 12 men dead. That night, McPherson gathered the shaken crew. He said quietly, "We learned something tonight. We don't fight like them. We strike, then vanish. That's who we are, or we don't come back."
That disastrous patrol had burned a lesson into their bones, a lesson paid for in blood. From that moment forward, every mission changed. Over the next 2 weeks, the men of PT-164 and her sister ships adapted, reshaping their tactics through trial and error. They learned how to shadow the radar-blind zones cast by island cliffs, how to idle silently on a single engine to reduce acoustic detection, and, most importantly, how to coordinate assaults using faint light signals undetectable to Japanese eyes. Their support network was nothing short of extraordinary. Australian coast watchers hidden in the hills of enemy-held islands relayed vital radio updates. Brave Solomon Islanders, risking their lives, paddled across open water in dugout canoes to deliver intel on enemy movements. Sometimes decoded transmissions from Pearl Harbor arrived with precise convoy times. But more often than not, they relied on instincts, luck, and each other. By July 1943, PT boats were still a closely guarded secret. In official Navy reports, these small craft were described only vaguely, labeled minor vessels or Mosquito boats. The Japanese knew something was attacking their nighttime convoys, but early reports described the threats as submarines or mines. They couldn't believe the Americans were reckless enough to send wooden boats into battle against steel destroyers. That misunderstanding was their greatest advantage. On the evening of July 18th, a message came from the Coast Watchers. A major Japanese reinforcement convoy would soon pass through Blackett Strait on its way to Kolombangara. This was the chance they had been waiting for. Several transports, escorted lightly, forced into narrow waters where numbers meant little. Commander McPherson volunteered to lead the ambush aboard PT-164. With him were PT-168 under Lieutenant Henry Bramwell and PT-171 commanded by Ensign Joseph or Joey Antonelli. The pre-mission briefing was intense. Intelligence suggested the convoy was transporting elite units from Japan's 13th Regiment, battle-hardened soldiers who'd fought in China and the Philippines. These weren't engineers or supply grunts. These were shock troops. If they made it to Kolombangara, the Marines fighting on New Georgia would be overwhelmed. Their squadron leader, Commander William Bill Specht, made it clear, "Gentlemen, this convoy doesn't reach Virginia. I don't care if you have to ram those transports. Sink them. Tonight." By sunset on July 19th, the sky over the Solomons burned a deep crimson. Final checks began. Paddy O'Brien reviewed his torpedoes again, adjusting the Mark 13 launchers for a 10-foot depth and 28-knot speed, perfect for a loaded transport. Charlie Mendoza fine-tuned the engines, bolting on makeshift mufflers to dampen noise. Dutch Vandenberg recalculated their attack vector again and again, factoring in currents, wind, and moonlight. Tom Harrigan double-checked the .50 caliber machine guns, ensuring the belts fed clean. They loaded nothing but armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. Standard ball ammo was useless against hulls. Every 5th round was a tracer, streaks of fire in the sky. At 8:30 p.m., the boats slipped away from the makeshift dock at Rendova. Engines hushed, they moved in a tight line through the gathering dark. Once clear of the harbor, Mac ordered a weapons test. For a brief moment, the silence was shattered by a roar. Machine guns and cannons barked into the sea. Then all fell quiet again. The engines pulsed steadily. Waves slapped against the hulls. The sea was rougher than they'd hoped. 2-foot swells would make accurate torpedo shots harder, but it also masked their wakes and muffled the engine hum. Any edge could save their lives. 80 feet of wood versus 400 feet of armored steel was never a fair fight. By 11 p.m. they reached their ambush point off Vella Lavella's northern shore. Mac idled the engines. The only sounds were water lapping against the hull and distant artillery echoes from New Georgia. At 11:47 p.m., Sparks caught a transmission. 3 large ships, 2 escorts, heading 280, speed 18 knots, range 15 miles. The game was on. Mac brought 2 engines back online, easing forward toward the intercept. The math was critical. The Japanese were holding 18 knots. PT boats could do 35 without leaving too much wake. If they moved fast but quiet, they could meet the convoy right at the pinch of Blackett Strait, where maneuvering was tight and options few. At 12:18 a.m., Dutch spotted them. Dark silhouettes against a star-filled sky, exactly where they should be. The enemy formation was tight, 2 destroyers leading, 3 transports in the middle, and a rear escort bringing up the tail. No running lights, but their mass and formation made them easy to track for trained eyes. Mac's plan was dangerous as it was brilliant. PT-168 would hit from the left, PT-171 from the right, and PT-164 would charge straight up the center, heading straight for the lead transport. That meant slipping between 2 destroyers, threading a needle between monsters. "All ahead slow," Mac whispered. The boats crept forward, barely moving. They let the convoy come to them. At 2,000 yards they heard the engines, deep, rumbling diesel throbs. At 1,500 yards they saw shapes, the pagoda bridge of the lead destroyer, cargo booms, silhouettes of men on deck. At 1,000, Mac tapped out the signal. 3 clicks. Engines roared as the PT boats lunged from the shadows. Water split beneath them as they surged toward their targets at 40 knots. The darkness exploded with sound and motion. The Japanese were completely caught off guard. Their watchers were trained to look for submarines or slow destroyers. They never expected an attack to come this fast from this close. PT-164 darted between the lead destroyers, machine guns blazing. Tom Harrigan opened up on the nearest bridge, rounds smashing through glass and bouncing off armor. Fire 1, Fire 2. Patty launched 2 Mark 13 torpedoes from just 600 yards. The fish leapt from the tubes and dove, leaving glowing trails beneath the surface. Then, impact. The first torpedo slammed into the front of the transport, just aft of the bridge. A thunderous explosion lit the sky. The second struck midships. The ship buckled, lifted, and broke apart, half of it sinking immediately, the other half groaning as it rolled and vanished. Screams echoed through the night. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers spilled into the sea. PT-168 followed up. Both of their torpedoes hit the second transport, this one filled with fuel and munitions. The result was cataclysmic. A fireball erupted that lit the sky like a sunrise, sending shockwaves that rocked PT-164 like a toy boat. Flaming debris rained down. Fires caught on the wooden deck. The crew stomped them out with boots and bare hands. The Japanese destroyers finally responded, but they faced a problem. The PT boats were too close. The destroyers' main guns couldn't depress low enough to hit them, and the boats were weaving between the transports, making clean shots impossible. So they tried to ram them. One destroyer turned hard, bearing down on PT-164 like a locomotive. They had seconds. "Hard starboard, full throttle," Mac shouted. Engines screamed in protest as the boat spun away, narrowly avoiding the steel prow by less than 10 feet. As they passed, Tom unloaded another belt into the enemy bridge, sparks flying from impact. PT-171 wasn't so lucky.
The Japanese gunners had finally adjusted their aim.
Bursts from 25mm cannons riddled the forward hull of PT-171, peppering the bow with shrapnel holes. One explosive round even struck a torpedo casing, but by sheer luck the warhead did not detonate. It needed to spin in water to arm itself, and that spin had not yet happened. Still, the damage was enough. Joey Antonelli had no choice but to break off his attack run, trailing smoke and taking on water as he limped away from the battlefield. The window of surprise had slammed shut. Now every spotlight in the Japanese formation swept across the waves, searching frantically. Gunfire of every caliber exploded outward in all directions, turning the sea into a hurricane of steel. Shells rained down like a tropical storm. Even worse, the Japanese finally brought their 5-inch guns to bear, guns that could split a PT boat in two with a single hit. "Launch the last of our fish and get us the hell out," Mac shouted from the bridge. Paddy O'Brien fired off the final pair of Mark 13s at the third and last enemy transport, but this captain was ready. Watching the torpedo wake slicing toward his ship, he turned hard, aligning parallel with the attack path. Both torpedoes missed clean. With no more torpedoes and the element of surprise gone, PT-164 made her escape. All three Packard engines screamed at full throttle as the boat weaved between geysers of water from near misses. They vanished into the dark as explosions faded behind them. The battle wasn't over, though. PT-168, despite taking some hits herself, managed to land another torpedo in the already sinking second transport. The deck, loaded with ammunition, erupted in sheets of flame. Secondary explosions rolled across the hull in rapid bursts as it finally slipped beneath the surface. Out of 3 transports, 2 were gone, along with nearly 6,000 enemy troops. The third transport and its escort destroyers had taken damage but remained afloat. South of the combat zone, 5 miles away, the 3 PT boats regrouped under cover of night. All had taken a beating, but none had gone under. PT-171 was in the worst shape, multiple holes near the waterline, and only 2 engines still operational. PT-164 came alongside and transferred injured crewmen, while the rest of the sailors stuffed the breaches with everything from mattresses to life vests. It was crude, but it worked. PT-168 had lost her radio antenna and splintered panels across the superstructure, but she was still fighting. As for PT-164, she had come out the luckiest. A few scorched marks, some shrapnel wounds, and a melted gun barrel, but otherwise intact. They had done their job. 2 enemy troop ships lay at the bottom of the sea. Thousands of soldiers were dead. The schedule of enemy reinforcements was shattered. The lone surviving transport abandoned its mission and turned back toward Rabaul. Their return to base was slow and stressful. At dawn, Japanese seaplanes began sweeping the skies, hunting for them. The PT boats cut their engines and hid in the shadows of palm-covered islets, draping themselves in branches and silence. They waited, hardly daring to breathe as the buzz of enemy planes passed overhead. What should have been a 3-hour trip took 14. But they made it back to Rendova. The debriefing was exhaustive. Intelligence officers picked their brains, asking about enemy tactics, weapon effectiveness, and Japanese response times. Every detail was recorded and forwarded to the Pacific Fleet. The tactics tested in blood that night would go on to shape doctrine across the entire theater, saving lives and sinking ships in the years to come. Yet the immediate impact was already evident. Radio intercepts showed panicked Japanese reports describing mysterious American boats, fast, agile, deadly. PT boats had a new reputation, ghost ships of the night. The Imperial Navy had lost its dominance after sundown. Gone were the days of unchallenged nighttime runs. Now every ripple might hide a torpedo boat. Every strange sound could mean danger. The Japanese had to adapt. Convoys grew in size but became infrequent. The number of escort destroyers doubled, then tripled. They began sending out flying boats armed with spotlights to scout at night. These shifts hampered Japanese supply lines. Island garrisons began to run short. Without steady reinforcements, the American forces gained momentum. But the psychological damage may have been greater than the strategic toll. Japanese soldiers, once expecting relief, began to feel abandoned. Officers, now unsure of safe delivery, canceled operations. The myth of nighttime invincibility had been shattered by wooden boats with volunteer crews. The attack off Vella Valella became a turning point. Word spread quickly through the Navy. More PT boat bases were established in the Solomons and New Guinea. Improved versions of the boats were rushed into production, featuring better armor, radar, and torpedo systems. The patchwork tactics, invented on the fly by Mack and his crew, were now formal training protocols from Rhode Island to California. The price of this success was steep. 2 weeks later, PT-166 struck a mine on patrol. Everyone on board died. PT-162 was caught dead in the water after a mechanical failure and torn apart by Japanese destroyers. Only 3 crew members survived. Joey Antonelli, skipper of PT-171, was killed by a sniper during a refueling stop. By the time Tom Harrigan was reassigned back to the States in October 1943 to help oversee ship production, their squadron had lost 7 boats and 73 men. But the cost had meaning. Their boats had destroyed or crippled over 40 enemy vessels, everything from destroyers to barges. Thousands of enemy troops never made it to battle. The exchange was brutal but vital. PT boats could be built again. Trained Japanese crews in combat ships were harder to replace. Tom returned to the Pacific in March 1944, serving as executive officer aboard PT-321 during operations in the Philippines. The boats had changed. They were faster, tougher, equipped with radar and better armed, but their soul remained the same, built on nerve, surprise, and speed. The Japanese never quite figured out how to fully counter them. They tried everything: dedicated hunter groups, radar destroyers, even kamikaze boats meant to ram them. But they couldn't be everywhere. They couldn't stop every shadow, and they never made the night safe again. Arthur McPherson survived the war, receiving the Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars. He stayed in the service and later commanded a destroyer squadron in Korea. He and Tom stayed in touch until Mac's death in 1987. At the funeral, his son shared that Mac always said he saw real courage aboard the PT boats, not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Dutch Vandenberg returned to Yale but never forgot the lessons from those dark waters. He became a leading American oceanographer, using the same skills he once used to avoid enemy ships to map the seafloor and currents. After dodging destroyers at 40 knots in the dark, he once told Tom, "Everything felt easy." Charlie Mendoza went back to building race engines in Los Angeles. His garage became a hot rod legend with a sign out front that read "Speed Shop." He used tricks learned on PT engines to make cars roar. "If I can make 4,500 horsepower push 50 tons at 45 knots, I can make anything go fast." Patty O'Brien stayed in the Navy and became a top torpedo expert. He authored the manual on maintaining the Mark 13, used well into the 1970s. But he never stopped talking about the fish they fired that night. "My torpedoes sank those transports," he'd say with pride. 2 shots, 2 hits, 6,000 Japanese who never reached the fight.
They had seen enemy aircraft approach before, but nothing could prepare them for the sudden violence of those torpedo boats. As if summoned from the shadows themselves, these small, vicious craft struck like snakes in the dark, then vanished before the enemy could draw breath. They changed the way war felt, made the sea itself a source of fear for the Japanese, turning the darkness they once mastered into a realm they no longer understood. It was a turning point. Since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy had dominated the Pacific, confident and relentless.
But when their seasoned sailors, trained their entire lives to fight by moonlight, started fearing shadows on the water, it was clear something had shifted. The psychological war was being won. The evolution of these torpedo boats during the conflict was extraordinary. The earliest models, like the ones Tom Harrigan and his crew served aboard, were hardly more than civilian designs repurposed for combat. But by 1945, these boats had changed dramatically, fitted with radar systems, rocket launchers, improved torpedoes, and even early guided munitions. Despite the upgrades, the core idea never changed. Lightweight, fast, lethal, and built for one thing: surprise. There was one story that captured the spirit of it all. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a group of torpedo boats, hopelessly outgunned, engaged the massive Japanese battleship Yamato. Their torpedoes could not even penetrate the mighty ship's armor belt, but they still attacked. Their courage forced the largest warship ever built to alter course, buying precious time for American escort carriers to escape. They did not sink the giant, but they may have saved the lives of hundreds that day. The bases they operated from became legendary in their own right. Names like Rendova, Tulagi, Mios, and Wanti carried with them the weight of sweat, malaria, and endless night missions. These were not the manicured bases of Pearl Harbor or San Diego. These were sweltering outposts where men lived on canned meat and black coffee, where mail came weeks late, if at all, and where the only recreation was cards and rumor. But morale stayed high because everyone knew what they were doing mattered. Local islanders, brave men and women native to the Solomon Islands, played a role few outside the service ever understood. They helped American crews navigate dangerous reefs, rescued downed airmen, and smuggled intelligence past Japanese lines at incredible personal risk. Many of them paid their bravery with their lives. Without their help, those boats would have been blind in a maze of islands and ocean. And then there were the coast watchers, unsung heroes who hid on Japanese-occupied islands with only radios and binoculars to guide them. Their alerts about enemy convoys or incoming bombers often meant the difference between victory and disaster. Though the torpedo boat crews rarely met these men face to face, they owed their lives to them more times than they could count. Technological advancements played their role too. Early radar units were clunky, often unable to tell a tree from a ship. But by the end of 1945, the torpedo boats could track targets through fog, rain, and total darkness. The Japanese, who had relied on superior night vision and discipline, suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage. The Americans could see them coming and strike first. Their tactics kept evolving. Strips of aluminum foil were dropped in the water to confuse Japanese radar. Wolf pack strategies, coordinated multi-angle attacks were perfected. Deception became an art form. Fake targets, bluff maneuvers, even using coastal artillery as distractions so the real strike could slip in undetected. But some of the most dangerous missions never made the reports. Dropping off coast watchers behind enemy lines, evacuating trapped Marines from isolated beaches under fire, delivering critical ammo and supplies to frontline outposts with no other lifeline. These were not the daring, flashy torpedo attacks that made headlines. These were the dirty, thankless jobs that saved lives by the dozens. The relationships aboard these wooden boats were unlike anything in the military. On a destroyer, a sailor might never know the name of every crew member. On a torpedo boat with 12 men aboard, you knew everything. Who snored, who had nightmares, who you could trust when things went bad. That closeness formed bonds that lasted a lifetime. Reunions decades later felt more like family gatherings than veteran ceremonies. And the food? barely edible. Rations, powdered eggs, and mystery meat were the norm. Drinking water was precious, saved strictly for survival. They bathed in salt water, leaving behind a film of salt that cracked skin and burned eyes. Coffee was black and strong enough to revive a dead engine. Some crews fished using grenades. Others bartered engine alcohol for fresh meals. Maintenance was a religion. Salt water corroded everything. The tropical heat rotted wood. High-speed chases wore down every part of the boat. If a motor failed out there, it was over. Every man learned to be a mechanic, a carpenter, and an electrician. They worked harder on keeping the boat alive than fighting the war. The weather was another beast altogether. Sudden storms could turn calm seas into watery mountains. Lightning strikes fried equipment. The humidity was so thick it could choke a man. But bad weather could be their best friend, masking engine noise, hiding wakes, shielding them from Japanese patrol planes. Navigating the Pacific was more art than science. Maps were outdated. Coral reefs shifted overnight. They learned to read watercolor, wave patterns, even scent. Some could smell land before they could see it. Their minds filled in where their tools failed. Every successful patrol carved new details into the mental maps they all shared. As the Japanese caught on, they adapted. They deployed shallow draft destroyers to chase the boats, paired spotter planes with warships, even tried using captured torpedo boats as bait. But for every trick they pulled, the Americans answered with one of their own. It was a high-speed chess match, played blindfolded at 40 knots. The mental toll was brutal. Every night they knew they might not return. Watching crewmates die in flashes of fire left scars. Some men cracked. Others became addicted to the adrenaline and volunteered for the worst jobs. Most just endured, finding strange comfort in dark humor and gallows jokes. They painted cartoon characters on torpedoes, named boats things like Sudden Death or Hell's Angels, made up songs about sinking Japanese ships, usually vulgar and loud. It kept the fear at bay. Their legacy stretched far beyond the Pacific. Torpedo boats guarded the Normandy landings from German fast attack craft. Lessons learned off the Solomons were applied in the Mediterranean, the English Channel, even on European rivers. The doctrine created by a few desperate men in wooden boats shaped naval tactics around the world for decades. Looking back, Tom Harrigan often wondered how they even survived. They were young, reckless, and should have died 100 times, but somehow they carved out a place in history. They took a crazy idea, fast boats with big weapons, and proved it could change a war. And that idea lives on. Every modern fast attack vessel carries a bit of their spirit. Every stealthy strike, every asymmetric assault is a nod to those Mosquito boats of World War II. When people asked Tom if he was proud of his service, he would tell them about that night. July 20th, 1943. 3 small boats, barely more than plywood and engines, took on a massive enemy convoy and turned the tide. They were the shadows, and the night belonged to them.